So let's talk about the Bible as story. Now, some people may say, but the Bible has 66 books, and it does. And it does have literature in there, by all means. But behind the books, behind the literature, is a story. And the people of antiquity were storytellers. So, with that, we will encounter today's session. So, let me go ahead and share the PowerPoint with you for today. So here we go, and you will see me in the caption here. Let's talk about that and engage the New Testament. So introducing the Bible story. One of the things that we will understand when we look at the overall story is that these books in the Bible don't necessarily tell a chronological story. That's very much so a Western thing to desire because we are chronological sorts of people. The people of antiquity in the ancient Near East, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and in the first century Mediterranean world, which we will encounter in the New Testament studies, they were storytellers. They were a narrative people. And so as we look at the Bible story, we will break it down into parts of the story as we progress throughout. The story of God encountering people and people encountering God. And so looking here, we see these bookshelves, right? It's kind of a simplified version of what you will encounter in a Protestant Bible. 39 books making up the Hebrew Bible, known as the Old Testament, and 27 books making up the New Testament. And they're presented in a certain order, right, in Christianity. But like I said, when we follow the story, we will see that you have to kind of reconstruct it in order to engage the overall story. And that's our aim in this course. Now, we will do so by reading the story itself, by reading the Bible, and we will have a textbook for that to guide us along in this. Now, make sure that you read the correct translation being used in this course so that when we have a quiz, we will have the correct wording. There's no such thing as like the ultimate best Bible translation, but for the purposes of this course, we will use what's called the New Revised Standard Version, abbreviated by NRSV. In your modules, those are available by hyperlinks. You can click on that. It will take you to a site on the internet. You can also follow that along on apps on your phone, like YouVersion or something. So make sure that you read the correct version there for this particular course. So the story of the Bible, you can break it down in several acts, as if it is a play with what you will see in interlude. Because even in our lives are shaped by an overarching story. You know, I could ask, like, what is your story? Like in my case, I wasn't born in the United States. I'm an immigrant. So my story starts in a different part of the world, in Europe. I have also spent some years in Southeast Asia. So that kind of shapes my story. It's also shaped by the fact that later on, I became a wife and a mother, and that shapes my perspective. But I'm a woman, and I think that shapes my perspective. I'm actually trained in the medical sciences first. And so that changes how I come at the story. So welcome to people that come out of the medical sciences and the health sciences as well. So let's look at this story. The story of the Bible, one way to tell it is to look at it from the perspective of God creating a community, the best community, ultimate community. And so in the first act, God creates this community. Often we call it like paradise. It's idyllic, and God seeks to commune with his created order, a communal God. And then that community takes matters into its own hands and things go south. It's no longer that idyllic kind of environment. But that's not where the story leaves off, because since God desires this idyllic idea there, this community that really thrives, God levels this promise that this community will be restored. And along the story, this is a lot of these books, right, in the Old Testament, along the story, God enters into a relationship with a specific group of people that we come to know as Israel, and they set an example of what this community might look like. Now, remember, It's a part of this community that kind of took matters into his own hands. And so it's a very bumpy ride. Before we then switch to the New Testament, there actually are about 400 years or so in between that time period. This community is still there, Israel, and Israel's community suffers as it encounters outsiders coming through and coming in, and it also just encounters suffering from within by their own doing. And so it yearns for the freedom to express who they are. We call this period the intertestamental period, the time between the two testaments, Old and New. And then we get to the part that we will study in this particular course, the New Testament, and we break it down in three more pieces. So this ideal community starts to take shape when Jesus comes on the scene. So he's the central figure of Christianity. We call him the Christ, which is really a word that means Messiah, promised one, deliverer, right? And we call him Jesus, Jesus, a Jewish name there. And he comes on a mission. So we will start this class by looking at the person of Jesus. And he surrounds himself, when he's a full-grown man, with people to kind of give this shape to what the community might look like. And he starts telling what it would look like. He often calls it the kingdom of God because he uses the language and the context and the culture of the time. Well, after Jesus' mission ends, and spoiler alert, people actually kill him, then he has the greatest upset of all of human history. He actually resurrects. He comes back to life. He's not resuscitated. He actually beats death, and then he's sent back into the spiritual realm. And he leaves the community with a mission to keep carrying out this idyllic community sort of thing. And these communities, these small communities that now live that out, they're the Jesus communities. And eventually we come to know them as the ecclesia, it has kind of a political overtone, but they become known as spiritual communities that we know nowadays as churches or the church. And they're on a mission to share what this restored community could look like. Because remember, the promise is to get back to Act 1. And eventually we read in these books, in these sermons of people, that God's plan is to indeed get back to that fulfillment, to get back to Act 1. One day, God will restore everything. The community of God will be fully realized. And we see like these previews of that. And that is an essential part of Christian belief, that God will restore. So in this course, we will very briefly look at that interlude. I see that the typing is off there. But we will focus on Acts 4 and 5, and we will briefly discuss what Acts 6 might look like. So what I want to do in the onset of looking ahead is that we just want to kind of paint a little bit of a picture of the life of Jesus, who he was, and Christians believe that he is alive today in the spiritual realm, and how this is not just a story contained within the Bible, but that even out in history, that we have some names and some days that correlate with the story of Jesus. So correlating extra biblical names, this means names outside the Bible, and dates with the text that we will encounter in the New Testament. So first of all, a broad timeline then of the person of Jesus. He is actually born in late BCE, that stands before Common Era or before Christ. These names are used interchangeably. Typically, people think he is born around the year 5. And we'll talk in a minute about how we got to that date. And then when he's a full-grown man, he starts a ministry, which means he travels around and he does kind of like a community outreach, and he has a message about what that community will look like. We think it started somewhere around the year 27 CE, Common Era, sometimes in Christian lingo called AD, which actually is Latin for Anno Domini. So let's stick to the current sort of lingo for that. Lasts about 3 years, and then we get to the final stage of Jesus's life, which is, we call it the Passion, because it goes to suffering. Some of you in the health sciences, pathos, right? Or in English sort of rhetoric, pathos. So that includes Jesus being mistreated. It includes his death, and then him beating death, the resurrection. So kind of 3 dates. I need you to hold on to those dates. I want to give some examples of names and dates that we find outside of the Bible story to show you that it extends into the greater context. So Palestine or Israel, and we will use these two names interchangeably, there's no political motivation for that, had local rulers who ruled on behalf of the ruling empire of the time, the Romans. So Herod the Great is a local ruler. And the dates that you see here are dates of his rule, 40 BCE to 4 BCE. And he dies somewhere in late March, early April. And the interesting thing is, if you're familiar with the Christmas story, when Jesus is born into the world, Herod the Great is alive when Jesus is born. So that's going to be very interesting, because if you count the year 0 as the year in which Jesus is born, Herod the Great would already have been dead. So we know that counting is off. In the Jesus story, as it is told in Luke, it mentions a Caesar Augustus. He is the head of the Roman Empire. And we see his dates of rule and reign, 31 BCE to 14 CE. Quirinius, he's a local governor. We see his name pop up. So all these names here that we have right here, those are all available in like ancient annals and writings and inscriptions. His dates are given as 6 to 8 CE. Tiberius, he's the next Caesar after Augustus. He actually co-reigns with Augustus when he falls ill, and we see the dates for that. Herod Antipas is one of Herod the Great's sons. We have some great reigns and rule dates there as well. And then Pontius Pilate, he is a local ruler who actually is mentioned as part of the trial of Jesus when he's condemned to death. We see his name pop up. The interesting thing here is all these names and all these dates, they come across our scene when we look outside the story of the Bible. So it's not like the Christian story is only contained within those books. So let's talk a little bit about Jesus's birth. And here you see a famous piece of art, the Nativity of Jesus. So a little bit about his date, right? So remember, when we read the story in the Bible, in the book of Matthew, chapter 2, and we will familiarize ourselves with those books, Jesus is born during the reign of the local ruler, Herod the Great. So he dies in 4 BCE. So Jesus must have been born before he died, which means Jesus is not born in the year 0. So how come we say the year 0? Well, because later, Christian people kind of got a little zealous, and they figured that the event of Jesus coming into the world was such a historical event that everything else should revolve around that. We should create a new calendar, and they did. But in their zeal, they missed this fact. So it's kind of funny to say that Jesus was born probably 4 or 5 years before Jesus, but this is where we get that. It also mentions a census, like the counting of people, like the census that we have here in America. That's mentioned in another book, gospel story, in the Gospel of Luke. It mentions there the census was ordered by Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So there was actually joint Palestine, Syria. Now remember just now that we noticed that he ruled between 6 and 8 CE. So that's kind of like a later date. So some people are like, that doesn't really match, because that would push Jesus's birth later. Well, that's not as much of a set in stone sort of date as Herod the Great. So some people think maybe there were 2 censuses, maybe it's kind of divided over time. So this one doesn't keep me up, but I want to be honest with you throughout the course here. We're just going to put facts out there. If one of these things doesn't line up, in our Western chronology, we can get really worked up over it. If these ducks don't all line up, that doesn't really affect me. I think God is big enough to take care of these things. But if you keep up with your reading in our book, remember, there's a good discussion about some options of that, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with that. Then Jesus' ministry years, the years that he went around through the community, traveled the land, and talked about that community that God once upon a time eyeballed in Act 1. And so some interesting things happened during that time. Here you see a work of art where Jesus actually is taking care of some things here, right? He does much ministry, as we call it, in Galilee. That's an upper part of Palestine. He actually grows up in a city called Nazareth. And next to Nazareth is actually a city called Sepphoris. And so if you look on the map here, you see that Sepphoris is actually only 3 or 4 miles from Nazareth. It's not mentioned in the Bible. So it's very interesting. But it actually is kind of very metropolitan. It would have been rather Gentile, which means non-Jewish, kind of a mixture of cultures. And Jesus and his family probably would have done a lot of artisan sort of work there. They would have done carpentry there, mason work. Jesus would have been familiar. He would have been exposed to all sorts of languages growing up. So that's a very interesting fact. And so he takes his ministry out there. How do you date that? Well, very interesting. In the Gospels, the Jesus stories, as they're told, you see a lot of interaction with Jesus with the temple, the holy site in Jerusalem, the capital of the country. And in the Gospel of John, it actually mentions an event where Jesus, just like in the work of art that you just now saw, where Jesus stands in the temple square. The temple is really a huge, complex building. And Jesus actually did not really care about that religious side for religious people, because he figured that the people had kind of commercialized it. It wasn't really about the people and God caring for people. It was about making money and taking advantage of things. And so Jesus really always had a bad taste in his mouth about the temple. You will notice that. And so at one point, Jesus just wants to take care of that. And he's like, oh, take all this stuff out of here, man. And he throws money in the air. People were like trying to make transactions there. And they have animals there they use for sacrifice, and he drives them out. And the disciples, his students he travels around with, they're like, whoa, what's going on? And so one of the disciples is kind of trying to save the day and goes, well, Jesus, look, at least it has really big stones, right? It's pretty. And Jesus goes, no, actually, these big stones, they will all come down. And in 3 days, I'm going to build a new temple, so to speak. I'm going to build it back up. And Jesus is actually kind of speaking in spiritual terms there. But they all go like, whoa. And it says in the text, it says, it took us 46 years to build this. So for people like me who are number nerds, this is kind of nice to know, because we know from an historian named Josephus that the rebuilding of this temple under the leadership of some of these rulers that kind of wanted to make nice, that started in like 20 or 19 BC. So if you add 46 years to it, you know that you stand there in the year 27. So that's kind of how we can work with dates. Another way that we can work with it, another central figure in the Jesus story is Jesus's cousin. And so that cousin actually mentions starting his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, which we saw start to co-reign in 11 or 12 CE. So that also gets you to the year 27. Luke mentions that Jesus was about 30 years old at one point, give or take. They're very broad in the way that they count their numbers, remember, because they're narrative people. And then from the Gospel of John, we can kind of count yearly reoccurring festivals within the religious realm. So the Jewish festival of Passover occurs 3 times in there, and maybe there's a 4th one. So this is how we kind of get to, it's about 3.5 years. And then, of course, we can correlate that to knowing when Jesus' passion takes place. And so here's another beautiful piece of art talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, we depict that kind of puritanical, right? Jesus is always wearing a loincloth. And in the section about crucifixion, we talk about the fact that it was really more shock value. So dating the passion then, Jesus was crucified on the 15th day of the Jewish month Nisan. In the Synoptics, which is the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we will learn that later, Jesus was crucified on a Friday. We know that because we can follow the religious establishment, and that we know it's the Sabbath and all that. And so you can kind of go back into the history of calendars and find that a Friday, Nisan 15, would have been in the year 30 or the year 33. Well, if you do 33, it gets about 6 years there of ministry, and it just doesn't really add up anymore. So it must have been in the year 30. Now, here's something that's very interesting. In the Gospel of John, that's the fourth one, Jesus is actually crucified on the day before that Jewish holiday, Passover. Remember, in the other three, it actually says that Jesus crucified on the Jewish holiday of Passover. Now, you may not be aware of that, so that would have been Nisan 14, right? What do you do with that? So do these books just don't match? Do these stories just don't match? What do we do with that? So let's think about that. Oh, let me share again. Sorry about that. Let's continue to go back to our screen here if we can. But maybe we don't. Maybe we just, okay, we are screen sharing. Maybe for a moment we go back to just seeing me. Okay, here we go. And here we go. So let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because the question then becomes quite apparent. How do we deal with these matters of reading text? And later on in the course, we will really spend time with this. Are these inconsistencies? Do the people not get the story straight? Or could something else be going on here? And I really want to talk about the latter here. Let's take a moment to really just think. So here's one way to learn how to deal with this, perhaps. This helps me. You see, in the synoptics, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we're following the story rather chronologically. That's real comfortable for us Westerners and people of the 21st century. From the Gospel of John, John tells a story. John is really into this narrative, and that's very much so what they did at the time, okay? So in the Gospel of John, and we're actually going to be watching a movie after the Gospel of John, right from the very beginning. It's very cryptic. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And you're like, what? Why don't they just say once upon a time, right? Because a story is going to be told. And pretty soon, there's the story of somebody preparing the way for Jesus coming as John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is baptizing. He's using these water rituals somewhere. And then Jesus walks upon the scene. It's like the perfect start of the story. Jesus is already full grown. He's starting this mission, this outreach to these communities. And John the Baptist sees this and he says, behold, the Lamb of God. And so he has this theme of Jesus being a Lamb of God. In fact, this whole thing about lambs and sheep and shepherds, you can find that throughout that gospel, that story of John. And in one point when Jesus is walking through the community, he says, you know, I'm like the good shepherds, like what you will actually read in the first part of the Bible, where God is portrayed as a good shepherd. Jesus says, actually, I am the good shepherd. I am God in the flesh, he's actually saying, but he's using this idea of sheep and a shepherd. And he says, and my sheep know me, they know my voice, and they follow me. So you're kind of picking up along the story that this idea of lamb and sheep and shepherd are telling the story of Jesus in a thematic way. And then when it comes to the last part of the story, the passion of Jesus, his suffering, we are encroaching on that holiday of the Jews where they celebrate Passover. And the holidays are very different and the traditions are very different. And if you're a person that's sensitive to animal suffering, I apologize here, but as part of their tradition, they would sacrifice a Passover lamb. They would take a little lamb and they would slaughter it. And it was symbolic, you know, different time, different things. And on the day that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is crucified, the people in that culture, in that religion, would slaughter that lamb, and then they would all cook it, and they would all eat that. And that had significant symbolism from earlier stories in the story of God as it played out. So John pretty much uses that to say, look, that's Jesus. That's the one that God promised to fix the story. Well, everything in me, as a chronological Western person, wants to cry out and say, well, that's not how you can tell a story. You're breaking the rules. And the question is John really breaking the rules? Or do we want a Western Bible, predetermined, that follows the rules that we set? But here's the kicker. The Bible doesn't come out of the West. Nobody says how you are supposed to write a story. This is an Eastern book out of a storytelling people. So there you have it. John uses a unique approach to tell the story. And the fact is Jesus still crucified? Yes. Does it point to who Jesus is? Yes. Is he crucified in a different day? Yes. Is that a big deal? Not storytelling people. Is it a big deal to people who like all the ducks in a row? Yes. Does that matter? I think you have to decide that for yourself. All right. Well, thank you.